People trust anesthesia because it appears to settle a question they are otherwise afraid to leave open. A body goes still, memory goes dark, responsiveness disappears, and the room receives what feels like proof. Consciousness was present, then the drugs entered, then the person vanished from experience, and when the drugs released their hold, the person returned. It looks clean enough to become doctrine. That doctrine is stronger than most people realize. It is not only a medical assumption about sedation and surgery. It quietly supports a larger worldview in which consciousness is treated as a product that can be switched off by chemical intervention, like flame removed by lack of oxygen. The implication is seductive because it feels final. If a molecule can erase awareness, then awareness must be nothing more than organized matter. But anesthesia does not actually reveal something so simple. It reveals a threshold event, a breakdown in access, integration, and reportability under altered brain conditions. Yet the human mind keeps translating that breakdown into annihilation. We do not say that consciousness became unreachable. We say it ended. We do not say the bridge between witness and world was severed. We say there was no witness at all. This is the first pressure point, and it matters because certainty arrives too early. The patient wakes and reports nothing, so everyone treats the gap as emptiness. Yet memory failure is not proof of absent experience. You forget most of your dreams, but dreaming still occurred. You can lose hours to automatic action and still have been dimly present. The absence of retrievable recall is one kind of evidence, but it is not the final court people pretend it is. A listener may object that anesthesia is different because it is not merely forgetfulness. It is designed specifically to abolish awareness, and clinicians have long experience distinguishing sedation, unconsciousness, and pain control. That objection deserves respect because anesthesia is not casual sleep, and drugs clearly do alter consciousness in powerful ways. But the question is not whether anesthesia changes consciousness. The question is whether the change proves extinction or only a collapse in the kinds of consciousness we know how to measure. Begin with the first vector, the pharmacological vector, because this is where the confidence usually lives. Different anesthetics do not work through one pure mechanism. Some enhance inhibitory signaling, some disrupt excitatory coordination, some alter thalamocortical communication. Some disturb the temporal binding by which a stable present is maintained. Even inside the operating room, there is no single off switch. There is a family of ways to scramble the conditions that ordinarily support coherent awareness. That fact alone should slow the conclusion down. If multiple pathways can all lead to what looks like unconsciousness, then what is being disrupted may not be a singular essence but a network of access conditions. The drugs do not all erase the same thing in the same way. They interfere with arousal, integration, sensory coupling, memory formation, salience, and timing across different profiles. The common endpoint may be a failure of reportable consciousness, but the route to that endpoint is structurally plural. Now notice the hidden leap people make. Because the endpoint looks behaviorally similar, they assume the underlying state is ontologically identical across cases. But similar outward silence does not guarantee identical inner conditions. A sleeping person, a dreaming person, a seizure patient, a delirious patient, and an anesthetized patient can all look disconnected while inhabiting very different experiential states. Outward quiet tempts the mind into false sameness. This is where the first vector deepens rather than resolves. Under some anesthetic agents, patients later report fragments. Sounds, pressure, voices, panic without movement, floating intervals, distorted presence without control. These are not the majority of cases, but they are not zero, and their existence destabilizes the idea that anesthesia simply turns awareness off. If awareness can intrude under the same general category of anesthesia, then the category itself is too coarse to support metaphysical certainty. The predictable response is to call such reports anomalies, dosing failures, or incomplete anesthesia. Sometimes that is exactly what they are, and that matters clinically. But philosophically, the anomaly is load-bearing. An anomaly undercuts the claim that anesthesia proves consciousness is a binary product of chemical organization. Once you admit that awareness can survive beneath expected suppression, even rarely, the entire model changes from extinction to uncertain access. The pharmacological vector therefore does not say anesthesia leaves consciousness untouched. That would be careless and false. It says anesthesia demonstrates how fragile reportable conscious coherence is under chemical disruption, while leaving open the deeper question of whether the witness is extinguished or rendered untranslatable. The difference between those two possibilities is not semantic. It is the difference between disappearance and occlusion. Now the second vector enters, and it cannot overlap with the first because it is not about molecules at all. It is about time. Most people think anesthesia proves unconsciousness because they experience it as temporal deletion. One moment they are in pre-op, and the next moment they are waking in recovery, with no felt passage in between. The gap appears total, so they call the interval empty. But temporal deletion is one of the easiest things for consciousness to misreport. Your sense of continuous time depends on encoding, sequencing, and post-event reconstruction. If those processes fail, the mind later narrates a jump cut. It says nothing happened because nothing was successfully woven into memory. Yet the jump cut is a property of recall, not direct proof of absence. This matters because a human being does not have direct access to states they failed to encode. You never remember the exact moment you fall asleep. You often do not remember transitions between stages of waking and dreaming. You rarely remember the fine grain of anesthesia induction or emergence. The mind then tells a story of blankness because narrative continuity was broken, and narrative continuity flatters itself by pretending it is the same thing as consciousness. A listener may resist again and say that these comparisons weaken the issue by mixing sleep, dream, and anesthesia, which are physiologically distinct. That is true, and the distinction should be preserved. The point is not that they are the same state. The point is that all of them expose the same epistemic weakness. Retrospective blankness does not prove experiential nothingness. It only proves that the ordinary machinery of ordered recall did not bring something back. Now the temporal vector thickens. Consider how emergence from anesthesia often feels. Some patients surface confused, emotional, frightened, combative, or oddly lucid in flashes before organized selfhood returns. These intervals reveal that consciousness does not behave like a light switch returning full power in a single instant. It behaves more like a field reassembling, with layers of orientation, self-recognition, memory, and bodily ownership returning unevenly. That unevenness should be heavier than people allow. If consciousness were simply absent and then present, the return would be cleaner. Instead, what often comes back first is not the whole person in narrative order but fragments, sensation without context, fear without explanation, hearing without map, effort without identity. This suggests that what anesthesia disrupts is not just presence itself, but the organization by which presence becomes recognizable to itself. So the temporal vector leaves a harder question than it answers. Was there truly nothing in the interval? Or was there an altered relation between experience and memory, between witness and sequence, between sensation and ownership? The honest answer is that we do not know cleanly, because the very tools needed to know were part of what was chemically destabilized. The blank retrospective report is real, but it is not metaphysical proof. This leads into the third vector, which is the measurement vector, and this one is the most quietly dangerous. The science of anesthesia relies heavily on indirect markers: behavior, physiological responses, brainwave signatures, processed indices, movement suppression, and later report. All of these are useful. None of them are direct measurements of consciousness itself. A processed EEG index can correlate with anesthetic depth, but correlation is not a window into inner life. Lack of movement can reflect paralysis rather than absence of awareness. Suppressed physiological stress can reflect medication rather than peace. Later amnesia can reflect memory blockade rather than non-experience. The entire framework is inferential, because consciousness is always inferred when direct report is unavailable. The public mind and even many educated listeners forget this. They talk as if a monitor reads consciousness directly, as if the machine has a number for being there. But the machine reads proxies. It reads patterns we associate with states that typically accompany diminished awareness. Those associations are strong enough for practice, but they are not final enough for ontology. Practical reliability is not the same as philosophical closure. Here the resistance hardens. If the proxies are reliable enough to perform surgery safely millions of times, then why keep the question open? Because safety and certainty are not identical goals. Medicine rightly acts on probabilities because action is required, but a model built for safe intervention can still overstate what it has truly explained. The operating room needs thresholds. Truth needs humility. The measurement vector becomes more unstable when you remember cases of intraoperative awareness. Some are traumatic, some partial, some vague, some disputed, and some clearly tied to paralysis without adequate hypnotic depth. They are rare relative to the whole, but rarity does not lighten their significance. Each case proves that the outward signs and monitored proxies can fail to map the inner state the way we want them to. That does not mean anesthesia is fake or surgery is guesswork. It means the confidence structure around what anesthesia proves about consciousness has been inflated by necessity. We learned how to suppress communication, memory, pain, and response well enough to practice medicine. Then many people quietly promoted that practical mastery into a deeper claim, that the mystery of consciousness had been solved by its apparent suppression. That promotion was premature. Now the final third begins, and synthesis can happen because the three vectors have each done their own work. The pharmacological vector showed that there is no singular off switch, only multiple ways of destabilizing the conditions for coherent reportable awareness. The temporal vector showed that retrospective blankness is not equivalent to proven non-experience. The measurement vector showed that our tools detect proxies and thresholds, not consciousness in itself. Put them together and anesthesia stops looking like a proof of materialist closure. It starts looking like a stress test for the relationship between consciousness, memory, access, and organization. The drugs undeniably alter the system. They can suppress, distort, block, and fragment. But the leap from suppression to extinction is no longer clean once the vectors are held at full weight. A listener may feel the pressure now and try one last stabilization. Fine, maybe anesthesia does not philosophically prove annihilation, but surely it still supports the idea that consciousness depends entirely on the brain, since changing brain chemistry changes awareness. Yet dependence of expression or access on a system does not by itself settle the nature of what is being accessed. Damage a radio and the music distorts. That tells you the interface matters. It does not by itself complete the metaphysics of music. The point is not to smuggle in a spiritual answer too quickly. That would be another escape from uncertainty. The point is to stop using anesthesia as a blunt weapon against questions it does not actually settle. Brain intervention clearly changes conscious life. But how it changes conscious life, what layers it blocks first, and whether the witness is extinguished or only rendered non-reportable remain more open than the popular story allows. This has ethical weight as well as theoretical weight. If anesthesia can create states in which memory is blocked more reliably than every form of inner registration, then we must be careful how we talk about the patient in the room. If our measurements are inferential and our categories practical rather than absolute, humility is not optional. The body on the table is not a solved equation merely because the monitors look calm, and there is a deeper mirror here. People want anesthesia to prove consciousness is reducible because they are weary of ambiguity. They want one dramatic demonstration, that the witness disappears when chemistry says so. But episode 9 does not give them that comfort. It gives them something heavier. The realization that what disappears most reliably under anesthesia may be organized access, coherent sequencing, and retrievable memory, while the question of the witness itself remains more difficult than the doctrine ever admitted. So the core insight has to remain under pressure. Anesthesia does not simply break consciousness. It breaks simplistic models of consciousness by showing how easily the visible marks of awareness can be chemically disrupted without giving us a direct instrument for deciding what, if anything, remained behind the blackout of memory and response. That is not mystical inflation. It is disciplined uncertainty. Hold the question in its hardest form. When the patient later says there was nothing, are they describing the interval itself or only the surviving architecture of recall? When the monitor reads depth, is it measuring absence or only the probability that the usual pathways of reportability have collapsed? And when chemistry makes the world unreachable, have we witnessed the death of awareness for a time, or only the failure of a system to translate awareness into anything medicine can safely recognize? The first comfort part 1 allowed was this. Maybe anesthesia does not prove total extinction, but it still probably creates a clean blackout most of the time, with only a few edge failures at the margins. That comfort has to be broken now, because it protects the old model by turning uncertainty into a small exception rather than a structural problem. The deeper issue is not that a few patients remain aware when they should not. The deeper issue is that the category of no awareness is being inferred from conditions that may only prove no usable access. Begin with the experiential vector, because this is where the human story turns unstable fastest. People wake from anesthesia and describe the interval as if time had been cut out with a blade. One moment there is a mask, a voice, a ceiling, and the next there is recovery, thirst, ache, and confusion. That report feels decisive because the gap is felt as nothing, yet felt nothingness is still a report from after the fact. Retrospective blankness flatters itself by sounding absolute. It says there was nothing because it cannot find anything to retrieve. But retrieval is not the same thing as occurrence. And human beings mistake that difference constantly. Your memory does not archive experience with perfect fidelity, and when its sequencing function fails, it writes silence over whatever it could not keep. This matters more under anesthesia because the machinery of time itself is chemically disturbed. Experience is not only about sensing. It is also about binding moments into continuity, stabilizing them into ownership, and carrying them forward into later recall. When those processes break, the mind may later report a void even if something less orderly than narrative consciousness moved through the interval. A listener may object that this sounds like wordplay designed to keep mystery alive. But the objection depends on a hidden belief that consciousness must either look like ordinary waking awareness or not exist at all. That binary is exactly what anesthesia makes harder to defend. If what is disrupted is sequencing, binding, and recall, then the disappearance of ordinary awareness does not settle whether some other unstable or unclaimed form remained. Think carefully about emergence, because emergence betrays more than people let it. Patients often return in fragments: sensation before orientation, fear before context, hearing before self-location, pain before story, effort before identity. The field does not seem to come back as one clean possession. It often reappears as a layered reconstruction, which means the interval before full return may not have been simple absence so much as inaccessible turbulence. That closes the first vector only enough to let the next one wound it further. The temporal gap after anesthesia is not neutral evidence. It is evidence filtered through damaged carryover, broken continuity, and later reconstruction. Once that is seen clearly, the statement there was nothing becomes less like a fact and more like a conclusion drawn from the failure of one system to bring back what another system may have partially undergone. Now enter the second vector, the vector of pain, salience, and implicit registration. People like to imagine anesthesia as a single blanket laid evenly over the whole organism. But anesthetic practice itself already knows this is false, which is why hypnosis, analgesia, amnesia, and immobility are not identical goals and are often supported by different agents. The clinical art quietly admits what the cultural myth denies. Different layers of the person go dark unevenly. This matters because if pain processing, stress signaling, and salience marking can be uncoupled from later report, then the absence of report is weaker than it appears. A body may register threat while the person later remembers nothing coherent. Stress hormones may rise, autonomic storms may appear, movement may be blocked by paralysis while inner aversion has nowhere to go. The immediate response is to say that nociception is not consciousness. That is true, and it should not be blurred. But nociception is not irrelevant either, because intense salience without later report exposes a larger truth. The organism can undergo meaningful registration that does not survive into ordinary narrative ownership. The line between unremembered suffering and absent suffering becomes far less clean than most people want. Now the pressure deepens. Intraoperative awareness cases are usually treated as dosing failures, exceptional breakdowns in a system that otherwise works as expected. Clinically, that framing is useful. Philosophically, it is too narrow, because it keeps the lesson trapped inside rarity rather than seeing what rarity reveals. What rarity reveals is that the layers we call consciousness can separate under chemical force more drastically than everyday models allow. Someone can be aware enough to later describe terror, pressure, voices, helplessness, or the horror of paralysis, yet not move, not signal, not protect themselves, and not be recognized by the room. This is not merely a warning about better dosing. It is a revelation about how much our confidence depends on outward quiet. Once paralysis enters the picture, stillness stops being evidence and becomes a mask. The second vector grows even darker when you remember that fear does not require reflective self-narration to matter. A creature can be terrified before it can explain terror. A human can register violation before it can turn that registration into a story. If anesthesia leaves islands of salience active while blocking narrative carryover, then a person may endure states that are experientially real, without later possessing them as orderly memory. That possibility resists resolution because it offends both camps. Reductionists dislike it because it keeps the inner question open. Sentimental interpreters dislike it because it does not guarantee a noble hidden witness serenely watching events. What it suggests instead is harsher. Consciousness under anesthesia may sometimes degrade into unstable fragments of aversion, pressure, alarm, or contact that do not mature into full autobiographical awareness yet still cannot be dismissed as nothing. This is why the old phrase "put under" is more ideological than factual. It reassures the family, the culture, and even the intellect that the person has been removed from moral exposure for a time. But if some layers can remain operational while others are chemically silenced, then "put under" is not a final description. It is a practical shorthand hiding a more uneven and morally loaded reality. That closes the second vector with something heavier than fear. It leaves the possibility that anesthesia does not simply suppress consciousness, but redistributes it into abnormal forms of registration that medicine can manage pragmatically without having fully explained. The question now becomes harder, not softer. If awareness can deform rather than vanish, what exactly are we measuring when we claim success? Now the third vector begins, and it cannot overlap with the first two, because it is about the architecture of science itself. The operating room runs on inference. Monitors do not read consciousness directly. They read heart rate, blood pressure, oxygenation, respiration, processed brain signals, movement, and sometimes reactions to stimulation, then bundle those signs into judgments about depth, safety, and likely awareness. That system is necessary, but necessity has inflated its philosophical authority. Because it works well enough most of the time, people quietly grant it more than it earns. They begin speaking as if consciousness has a meter. They act as if a number on a screen has crossed from correlation into direct perception. But an index is only a model of likely state under chosen assumptions. The assumptions matter because every model has blind spots built into its design. A processed signal may be calibrated on typical brains, typical pathways, typical drug responses, typical developmental histories. Real human beings are not typical in the way machines prefer. Age, trauma, tolerance, neurodivergence, injury, prior exposure, and countless physiological variables can all shift how the same number maps onto lived reality. A listener may say that none of this undermines the practical success of anesthesiology. Correct. It does not need to undermine that to undermine the metaphysical overreach attached to it. Practical systems can be extraordinarily successful while still measuring a proxy rather than the thing itself. Weather models can save lives without becoming the sky. The problem sharpens when we ask what the monitor must ignore in order to function. It cannot detect meanings that are too private to signal. It cannot detect fragments of awareness that fail to stabilize into the patterns it was trained to recognize. It cannot distinguish with certainty between true absence and inaccessible presence when both states flatten into similar outward signatures. The map must simplify, and simplification always hides what matters most at the edge. This produces a second destabilization that part one did not yet force clearly enough. Even if anesthesia usually makes ordinary consciousness unreachable, the science around it may still be structurally unable to tell the difference between extinguished awareness and awareness that has lost the channels needed to declare itself. That is not a minor technical caveat. That is a wound at the center of how certainty gets manufactured. So the third vector ends where it was always heading. The stronger the practical need for decisive categories, the greater the temptation to confuse operational confidence with ontological truth. The monitor helps manage bodies under risk. It does not settle the nature of the witness. The profession can remain skilled and admirable while the worldview built on top of its tools remains overstated. Now the final third can synthesize because the three wounds are opened separately. The experiential vector showed that blank time after anesthesia is a report from damaged recall rather than a direct view of what the interval contained. The salience vector showed that meaningful registration can persist or deform without later narrative ownership. The measurement vector showed that the tools used to judge depth are inferential and cannot directly arbitrate the presence or absence of the witness. Put together, these vectors do not prove that consciousness remains fully present under anesthesia. That would be another dishonest leap. What they prove is that anesthesia cannot bear the philosophical burden people keep placing on it. It cannot honestly function as the great final demonstration that consciousness is nothing more than matter switched off by chemistry, because what it most clearly demonstrates is the chemical fragility of access, sequence, salience, and report. This changes how the entire topic should be spoken about. Instead of saying anesthesia turns consciousness off, the more disciplined statement is that anesthesia can disrupt the conditions by which consciousness becomes coherent, reportable, memorable, and behaviorally available. That is less satisfying, but more true to what the evidence can hold. It is also far more destabilizing, because it leaves the deepest question alive exactly where many people wanted it buried. A reductionist may still push back and say that dependence remains dependence. Change the brain, change the mind, therefore the issue is settled. But dependence of appearance on a system does not settle the full nature of what appears through it. Destroy a lens and vision changes. That shows mediation. It does not by itself exhaust ontology. The fact that chemistry can silence expression does not grant chemistry the last word on being. Yet the sentimental opposite is no refuge either. You cannot use this uncertainty to claim that the full self serenely floats above anesthetic disruption untouched. The vectors do not justify that. What they justify is a harsher humility. They suggest that consciousness may be more layered, deformable, and difficult to erase or detect than either comfort story allows. That is not soothing, it is more demanding. And this is where the moral force returns. If anesthesia does not give us clean proof of total absence, then the patient on the table remains inside a zone of disciplined uncertainty. The room must act. The surgery must proceed. The medicine must trust its thresholds. But the worldview surrounding those actions should lose its arrogance. Calm monitors absent memory, and outward stillness no longer authorize premature certainty about what reality was like from the inside. So hold the insight in its sharpest form. Anesthesia does not just interrupt consciousness. It exposes how easily we mistake broken recall for broken being, how quickly we confuse suppressed signal with vanished witness, and how eagerly we let useful instruments overclaim what they can truly know. That is why it breaks consciousness models. Not because it solves the mystery, but because it shows how thin our earlier confidence was. Now let the question remain where it hurts. When the patient later says there was nothing, are they speaking for the interval itself or only for the memory architecture that survived it? When the body stays quiet, are we seeing peace, paralysis, or untranslatable distress? When the monitor gives reassurance, is it mapping absence, or merely the collapse of the pathways by which absence and presence usually become distinguishable? Until those questions can be answered without borrowed certainty, anesthesia remains not a proof of closure, but a disciplined invitation to stop pretending we solved consciousness when we only learned how to interrupt its ordinary display. If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.